All right, good morning, everyone. Go ahead and have a seat. All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Good to see you, and I hope you all had a good night. We are back on the record. We have counsel and parties present, and you may recall we let you go a little bit early yesterday because we moved fairly quickly and got through all the witnesses the state had available yesterday. And I believe the state now has a witness here ready to go. Mr. Ringel, do you have a witness to call for the state?
Yes, Judge. The state would call Ken Martin.
Good morning, sir. Come on up here to the chair to my left, if you would, or far left. Sir, that microphone's got a little button at the bottom of it. There you go. Yep, and you can adjust it however you'd like.
Sure. Thank you.
And first thing I'm going to do, sir, is swear you in. If you please raise your right hand. Sir, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you'll be giving in these proceedings will be the truth?
Yes, sir, I do.
All right. And then, sir, for the record, can you please provide us with your first name and your last name and spell them?
Sure. My first name is Kenneth, K-E-N-N-E-T-H. Last name Martin, M-A-R-T-I-N.
All right. Mr. Ringel?
Thank you, Judge. Morning, Mr. Martin.
Morning, sir.
Sir, how are you employed?
Presently, I'm employed with Bevel Gardner and Associates as a forensic analyst since 2007. I'm also employed by the Boston University School of Medicine as an adjunct instructor in their forensic program, graduate forensic program. And I just took a position as an adjunct instructor with Oklahoma State University in their forensic program.
What are you doing for Bevel Gardner?
As a forensic analyst, I conduct trainings across the country in the area of bloodstain pattern analysis, crime scene reconstruction, crime scene processing. I also receive cases from not only the U.S. but from internationally as well, both for the prosecution and defense. So I'll review the case. In some instances, I'll testify. Also in civil cases as well, I'll review cases and provide testimony if necessary.
You said you're also employed as an adjunct professor.
Yes, sir.
What are you doing as an adjunct professor?
Both at Boston University and Oklahoma State University, I'll be teaching a course in bloodstain pattern analysis.
Could you describe your educational background?
I have a bachelor's degree in biology. I have a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, a master's degree in criminal justice, and I'm presently a PhD candidate at Oklahoma State University.
Could you outline for the jury your training and experience?
As far as training, I have attended numerous courses. I started as far as attending courses. In 1980, I joined the Massachusetts State Police, where I spent a year and a half on the road. Essentially, the Massachusetts State Police is a little bit unique in that we handle all of the law enforcement capacity across the state. In that the district attorney, we call them district attorneys, you call them county prosecutors here. The Attorney General's office, we essentially have persons assigned there. Likewise, Logan Airport. Even for the medical examiner, we supply all the forensic services. So again, I started in 1980. In 1982, I ended up going to the Bristol County District Attorney's office, where I spent 9 years there as an investigator. And basically, we investigate all homicides throughout the state, any sudden unattended deaths. Basically, by statute, the district attorney's in charge of all cases. That's where I first started forensics, my forensic training. Ultimately, in '92, I wrote a letter to the agency, my department, and said we need to reorganize. Based upon that, they created what's called the Crime Scene Services section. I spent the tenure of the rest of my career there, which was almost 33 years, not only within the section, but also in charge of the section. And I spent 7 years at the medical examiner's office. Again, we supply all the forensic services. So all the forensic services entail processing bodies for latent print evidence, hairs and fibers, trace evidence. Not only that, but I had the duty of where it's the medical examiner's office, amongst the teaching hospitals, as the residents would cycle through, I would also do training with them regarding crime scene processing, bloodstain analysis, for their part of their education.
Outside of your work as an adjunct professor and what you've just outlined, do you engage in any additional training or teaching?
Again, I belong to various organizations, forensic organizations, so I annually attend meetings of these organizations. For example, the International Association for Identification. Excuse me. I was actually the president from 2007 to 2008 with the International Association for Identification. I'm certified as a senior crime scene analyst, bloodstain pattern analyst, as well as a footwear analyst. I also belong to the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, the International Association of Bloodstain Pattern Analysts, as well as the Association of Crime Scene Reconstructionists. And each one of those organizations has an annual meeting that I will attend, either one or multiple during the year.
Do you publish?
I've published in the past. I've published an article regarding latent prints and how latent prints can transfer onto various surfaces in the reverse position. I've also published with the Boston University Engineering Department in two areas of bloodstain pattern analysis, looking at the length of the tail of a bloodstain, and also on, it's called micro coatings on a surface, which essentially you could literally get a blood droplet to bounce off of a surface if you had the proper coating on there.
You have a CV, is that correct?
Yes, sir, I do.
Judge may approach.
You may. And to the extent you want to come up again with this witness, you don't need to ask.
I'm showing you what's been marked as exhibit number 14. You recognize that?
Just a minute, please. Yes, sir, I do.
And is that your CV that fully outlines your training, experience, and educational background?
Yes, sir, it does.
By stipulation of the parties, the state moves to admit states exhibit number 14.
Any objection?
No objection.
All right. State's Exhibit 314 is admitted.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Martin, you're here to testify about bloodstain pattern analysis, correct?
And reconstruction, yes, sir.
And have you prepared a demonstrative exhibit that outlines the basics of bloodstain pattern analysis?
Yes, sir, I have.
Would that assist you in testifying here today?
Yes, sir, it would.
Judge, with permission of the court, I would request to publish the demonstrative exhibit just referenced.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
All right.
Presumably you can see that okay, correct?
Yes, sir, I can.
All right. So what is bloodstain pattern analysis?
Just would you back up a moment, please, just to the introductory slide, if you don't
Certainly.
mind? Thank you. Again, this is my introductory slide. What I would like you to take note of here, that happens to be a right hand, but also we can see, essentially, this is an artist's rendition of an injury to an index finger, and we can see 3 droplets of blood as they're falling due to gravity towards the, in this particular case, towards the ground. So essentially, when we take a look at bloodstain pattern analysis, it's the scientific study of blood in motion in flight. Basically, we're talking about fluid dynamics, which is a subdivision of fluid mechanics. And what we look for is the size, shape, and the distribution of the stains, the resulting stains. Because what's interesting about bloodstain pattern analysis is that it's reproducible and predictable. In other words, blood will act or react from a force in a predictable fashion. In other words, if I were to place some blood in my hand, blood is a fluid. Basically, it's a liquid. Fluid encompasses both gases and liquids. If I were to place some blood in my hand, it's a liquid. If I were to slap it in this fashion, well, I can tell you right now, it's going to react in a predictable manner. This is called impact, so as I impact it, it's going to radiate out. So depending on the stains that are left behind, we can go back and based upon the size, shape, distribution, and the location of the stains, we can identify the mechanism. In this case, it's a impact spatter. So from the mechanism, we can tell, or we're able to deduce what type of implement may have been used or what caused this type of event to occur.
And so what is crime scene reconstruction then?
Now, reconstruction is slightly different in that Reconstruction involves bloodstain pattern analysis. In fact, I look at bloodstain pattern analysis as a lesser included discipline because overall, crime scene reconstruction holistically looks at the scene and what we have for evidence. So not every scene includes bloodstain, but we do have bloodstain if we need it. Shooting incident reconstruction is another sub-discipline which is included in crime scene reconstruction. Not only that, but we look at medical legal death investigation, in that if I were to look at a case and say I have some type of arterial spurt, you may have heard the term, first of all, I need to know that there's some type of artery breach in order to create that arterial spurt. Not only that, but we have to have some knowledge of basic crime scene. In some instances, you can go back and retest evidence, again, to get some indication as to, number one, is it blood? Whose blood could it be? So you have to have an overall understanding of the forensic sciences and what you can do or can't do. And then lastly, you have to have a methodology, because all scientific disciplines have a methodology involved in which you can actually look at all of the evidence, and that's the one thing in crime scene reconstruction. Ultimately, you have to consider all of the options. You know, many times you hear the term bias and that you're only looking at, or you're looking at information that you shouldn't. Well, ultimately, that gets to a point in crime scene reconstruction where we have to entertain all possibilities. And let's just say we have 10. Through the examination of the evidence, we may be able to eliminate 7. We may be left with 3. And of those 3, one of them may be the most likely possibility or the most likely occurrence that happened to have created what we have as far as the resulting scene. Now, the other interesting thing here, and I have a photograph, it's a photograph that I prepared. We have a diagram on the left, and what you have to remember about bloodstain pattern analysis, it's different than most of the other forensic disciplines if you think about it. And I'm sure maybe you've seen some type of show where you get square over the evidence. You have to be perpendicular when you take your photo. We're looking at the north wall, the east wall. Well, in my diagram here on the left-hand side, if you notice in that lower right corner, I have some red, and those are to illustrate so-called bloodstains which are left behind. Well, in the case that I have here, bloodstain evidence is different in that, in this case, and let's just say north is at the base of the diagram here, so that would be west on your left. Here we have a pattern that extends across from the west wall across the north wall. So my point is, we're looking at not only one wall, but we have to encompass or take in the entirety of the scene. So one of the biggest mistakes is that people focus on a small area when you need to back up and look at the big picture. So what I'm saying here is we process a scene, we need to, again, look at the scene three-dimensionally. Now, on the right-hand side, these are 2 photos that I took that when you look at photographs, as I did in this case, or if we have videos, you need to look at all of the photos. And the reason being, and let's just see, this is the typical laboratory photo you would see when clothing gets submitted to the lab. I think you would agree, it appears that I put the scale that's called ruler tape in there, so we see the tape. And basically what I'm trying to note here, those could be potentially blood stains. So initially they appear to be on the front of the garment. Now when the person puts on the garment, if you notice, the stains are actually on the side of the garment, or on the side of the wearer. So we need to be very careful. And so one of the things that we need to do is to look at any and all photos available, any videos available, autopsy photos. So again, the photographs, especially if you don't get a chance to go to the scene, and even at that, if you go to the scene, many times the victim may have been already removed from the scene. So what I'm getting at is we have to look at everything. A good example right here, if I were to take a photograph here, arguably my fingers are, let's just say, 10 inches apart, but depending on how I hold my fingers and take that photograph, because a photograph essentially is a 2-dimensional format trying to depict the 3-dimensional scene. So in that photograph, my fingers appear to be 2 inches apart, 2-dimensionally, but when you look at them, when I twisted them around, they're really 10 inches apart. So again, we need to consider all of the evidence.
And just to be clear, the image that we see both on the left and the 2 images on the right of the garment that you referenced, those are not related to this case in any way?
Not at all. No, these are just generic images, just to understand what we're looking at.
What are we seeing here?
Well, what we have is essentially some blood, and you can see here that blood is an interesting, it's a fluid, so essentially it has to obey the laws of fluid dynamics. But how it's comprised, roughly 55% is plasma, and also we have the 45% of formed elements, which are red cells, white cells, and platelets. And based upon that, certain things do happen. For example, blood, the viscosity of blood is greater than that of water. You've heard the term blood is thicker than water. So there's some various aspects to this which is exclusive to blood. Not only that, for example, platelets are involved in the clotting process, which is very important too, because ultimately, sometimes before blood can dry, or many times, it will actually clot prior to it drying, and platelets have a major role in the clotting of blood.
A couple of terms that you use there, obviously you're applying scientific principles to the study of blood and blood stain patterns. You mentioned fluid dynamics.
Yes.
What is just generally sort of a layperson's understanding or explanation of what fluid dynamics is?
Fluid dynamics is just fluid in motion, okay? And again, fluids, just to make it clear, liquids of fluids, likewise air. And the only thing I would say to that is that here I have a droplet that's falling. Air is a fluid, so it has to make its way through the fluid, just like a boat has to make its way through the water. There's the two things, or the two major factors when a droplet falls, is aerodynamic drag pushing up on the droplet, just to make that.
And so,
Just apologizing for the noise. I'm not sure what it is. You may hear that. I know that they're doing a little work on our air conditioning equipment here. That's, you may have noticed it's a little warm in here, has been. We have a very old air conditioning system in this building. I know they're doing a little work on it today. So that may be it, but I don't know. But just apologizing for the little background hum you hear. Sorry, Mr. Ringel, go ahead.
thank you, Judge. So you're applying scientific principles to the study of blood.
Yes, sir.
All right. I believe this is animated, is that correct?
Yeah, and if you think back to that first slide that I had, we had the droplets, literally, and if I were to prick my finger and I tried to recreate that, and we had those droplets. Well, this is an actual droplet of blood falling from a finger, and basically this is high-speed video, and I'm sure you've seen that. In this particular case, we have 1,000 frames per second as this droplet. What happens is the droplet begins to amass on the tip of the finger, and ultimately gravity is always pulling down. So ultimately, gravity, as it's pulling down, the mass of that blood, what's going on here is there's cohesive, in other words, there's an attraction between the blood and the finger, and there's also something called surface tension. It's holding the blood together, and as that blood amasses, it just can't hold on anymore, and it pulls away. And what you saw in the initial video is that droplet. Well, here's actually what happens, because once it pulls away, you never really see what happens, but I have it here. If you notice, here the droplet, that's called the ligament. It begins to stretch out. But interestingly enough, once that snaps, once it pulls away, if you notice, the droplet immediately becomes a sphere, or, for another term, a ball. And basically, that's what happens. All liquids are going to assume that sphere or ball shape, and that's why it's predictable and reproducible. Because, again, it's following the laws of fluid dynamics. If you noticed, there's a couple things. There's a little bit of, it's called oscillation, is the droplet. In fact, if you've ever thrown a water balloon, sometimes you get this going on by the water balloon. Well, it dampens itself down and ultimately assumes that sphere. But ultimately, as that ligament pulls, if you notice, there's a little follow-on or accompanying droplet that forms, because it's almost like an elastic. It snaps because that surface tension pulls that droplet back together.
And I'm going to ask you to slow down just a little bit for our court reporter's sake. All right. Moving on to the next slide. What are we seeing here? I think you just referenced surface tension.
Sure. So this is a photograph that I took. I took a pipette, basically a dropper, okay, and I had some blood in it. And here I have a piece of foam. So what I did was very carefully try to put the droplet onto the foam, Because as I mentioned before, blood wants to stay together. It doesn't want to separate. It wants to hold itself together, and surface tension does hold it together in that sphere or ball. And again, what I did very carefully was put it down on the foam, and you would think, if I asked you beforehand, that the blood would just flow through there. No, if you're very careful, there's the actual droplet sitting on top of the foam. So again, it wants to stay together unless it's acted upon by some type of outside force.
And again, this is the application of the concepts of fluid dynamics to blood and, again, bloodstain pattern analysis, correct?
Yes, sir.
And essentially it's physics. These are the principles of physics.
Yes, sir.
All right, what are we seeing here?
So before we start the slide, there are two slides which go together. The first slide is a smooth cardboard surface, and it's roughly 100 centimeters. So 100 centimeters, that's roughly 39 1/3 inches, so roughly 40 inches off the ground. What they've done in these high-speed videos is they've let a droplet of blood go. And ultimately, gravity is going to pull it down to the ground, and this surface, that cardstock or that cardboard. But what we're looking at here, or the purpose of the two slides, is surface texture. In other words, the surface that it strikes is going to, for the most part, govern what the droplet looks like. So in other words, you'll see here on a smooth surface, it's going to assume that circular shape. Whether I drop it at 10 feet, 100 feet, it's going to come down. If that surface is smooth, you're going to get that circular shape. Likewise, if I have a rough surface, it's going to break up. Think about it, it's hitting that rough surface, so basically it's going to break up. So the first one is hitting a smooth surface at roughly 40 inches. Notice what happens, it stays pretty much circular. And that's a typical drop that you might have on a smooth kitchen floor. In fact, the smoother the surface, glass, polished glass is probably the smoothest surface, you're going to get that nice circular stain. Now if we move to the next slide, same 100 centimeters, roughly 40 inches, and what we have here is a blood droplet hitting, and you can see it off to the left-hand side. That's cement board that you could buy at Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever. Again, same height, same size droplet, and you'll see what happens. Major difference. And again, it's the surface texture that that blood hits. Many times it was believed in the past that when you saw something like that, it's because the droplet, say, was flicked, that had some type of energy as the droplet's hitting. But essentially, it's actually the surface texture that the droplet, in this case, the cement board, which causes that breakup of the droplet. Now, what's important with this slide here is, we saw those two previous slides, and again, this is cardstock. Now, this is something that I put together, and I have 10 through 80 degrees. And what we're looking at there, if I were to take blood right now, and I were to drop it here on this countertop, that's 90 degrees. You would agree with me, right? Ultimately, it's going to fall and hit. That gives you that circular stain. As I change the angle, okay, 10 degrees being the most acute, so 10 degrees is this, something like this, okay? So we see 10 degrees here. What's happening is the droplet, as it hits, basically that sphere or ball, it remains in that shape. So my example was, if you were to go to Michael's or one of those home places where you can buy styrofoam balls, and I would take a piece of sandpaper, take a look at that 10 degree, as I would take that styrofoam ball, and if I slide it down, now remember it's at 10 degrees, as I slide it down, at the midpoint of that styrofoam ball, it's going to be its widest, right? Likewise, as I continue to slide it, it's going to get back to its narrowest. And what that allows us to do is there's a relationship between the length of the stain and the width of the stain, where we can go back and get what's called the impact angle. Now, this is looking at something like this, okay? If you look at my, if you look at my arm, now we're talking about a surface like this, okay? 90 degrees. We're talking about 10 degrees. But on the other hand, we could do the same thing if I had a wall. Now let's just say this is my wall here. Remember I said if I do that? If I do this is impact. Well, when I do this impact, essentially, the blood that's coming out from between my hands, it's going to shoot straight out. So that's going to hit straight on, so that would be 90 degrees, correct? So if I hit something like this, it's going to force it out. Straight on is 90 degrees. If I hit it sufficiently and it starts to go up, because what's going to happen is it's going to be directed, say upwards, because I have it directed upwards, you're going to start getting that stain going something like this. So my point is, even though I have a stain here, if I were to take a pool of blood, and let's just say I hit that with a hammer, I can tell you right now, I'll have some stains here, 90 degree circles, but I'll also have some climbing up, and the more they climb, the more elongated they come or become. The tail always points to where it's going. The tail points to where it's going. So in this instance, if you notice, the tails are on the bottom, and as I told you before, I created that with the cardstock in this fashion, so we know I dropped it from above and it's going downward. But again, when we look at a scene, there are occasions when I actually have these elliptical stains going up a wall. So again, it's telling me tail's going up. It came from this direction. Not only that, but I can estimate or I can approximate the angle of what they call impact. So again, the shape of the stain is very important. Oh, I'm sorry. In this last photograph here, that's an example of the tail. If you notice, that green arrow goes down, and you can see the head of the arrow is in that downward position. So essentially, all of those stains are going downward. These two videos, one's taken straight on and one's taken from the side. And we can see it's 2,000 frames per second. Basically, it's 10 degrees. So if we take a look in the middle, that cardstock, we can see that 10 degree, and I've put it in there. And what I want you to take a look at there as we play the left and then the right, remember I told you before, that sphere or that ball, as it skids along, it maintains its overall shape. It just paints it as it goes along. Or consider that styrofoam ball as it slides along. And you'll see here, if we play the left one, as that stain, notice as it hits, it maintains its shape. And ultimately, notice there's the tail. So again, it's maintained that shape. We have that ellipse. If I had to, I could measure they call that the leading edge at the top. I could measure the base of the stain, and I could actually estimate, or I could calculate the impact angle. In this particular case, it's 10. Now, in the right side, if we take a look at it, this is just to show you that it maintains its spherical shape as it skids along that surface. And again, why that's important, if I have a vertical surface, it's not uncommon to see stains. Think about it, is that spatter goes along that vertical surface. It's not straight on, so it's not circular. Instead, it's coming in at an angle. So when I look at those angles, it's going to tell me that that stain came in at an angle. It's not straight on. So I can position items. Think about that. Just one quick example. If I take a Coke can, which I've had numerous times, or a beer can, any type of can, cylindrical, right? It's round. If I have that on the table and I have something go on, let's just say I do this same thing. Well, that Coke can, where it directly faces that spatter coming in, I'll have circles. But on the sides of the Coke can, you say, well, why do I have these stains skidding along and I have these ellipses going this way? Well, guess what? Even though this one hits straight on, these are skidding along the side, so I get those elongated stains. And what that allows me to do, if you think about it, is position the can, because let's just say the can got knocked over, position the can as to where it was at the time of the event. The other important thing to remember is that the harder or the more force I impart on something, just a quick example, if I were to take two water balloons, if I take a bat, say I have a water balloon here, and I hit it just sufficiently enough to break that skin, and again, remember, blood, the surface tension, the blood itself is the skin, but in this case, I'm using the example of a water balloon, which is totally different than the water contained within. If I just hit it, what happens? it just kind of breaks up and will run down my arm for the most part, right? But think about it, if I take that same size water balloon, the harder I hit it, and let's just say I really wind up and hit that thing, what's going to happen? I've got, in this case, the term is spatter. I've got water all over the place, right? And the harder I hit something, the smaller the resulting stains. So again, one of the things that we look for, if you remember back to when I talked about it, size of the stain, shape of the stain, elliptical, circular, distribution. So again, the harder I hit something, the smaller the resulting stain. In this particular video here, what you're looking at, as we talk about energy or we talk about force, this happens to be a .22 caliber bullet striking a bloody sponge. One of the things that, I'm sorry, I'm just a little closer. One of the things that we take a look at is, if you think about it, a bullet, depending on what type of round I use, whether it's a .22 or a .45 or whatever, certainly has a certain amount of energy, kinetic energy or potential energy in that bullet, okay? And what we have here is, this is a sponge, and when we teach the class, this is pretty much universal. We all use a sponge out there, because certainly that's really the best representation we have. But the point is, when you see this, when you take a look at the size of the stain, this is where it becomes mist-like. The best example I can give you is if you were to go to the dollar store and you buy one of those pump bottles and you fill it up and you press that as hard as you can, what happens? You're only going to get a little mist. And the other thing to remember with this misting is that the smaller the stain, the less distance it travels. So the smaller the stain, there's more energy to create these small stains. Likewise, they don't go very far, because again, go back to my example of that pump bottle from the dollar store. No matter how hard you push that, that little misting doesn't go very far, does it? And again, it deals with fluid dynamics, but again, the smaller the stain, the closer to the source you'll find the stain. So here we go here. This is 22, it's going right to left. Yeah, right to left. And what you have here is, you have, it's called forward spatter to the left. It's going with the bullet, so the predominance of the spatter is going to go forward. And likewise, what you also have is you have what's called back spatter too. So some of that blood, in this case on the sponge, is coming back towards in this case, the shooter or the barrel of the weapon. And depending on how close the barrel is, I've actually had cases where blood actually will get projected into the barrel itself. So depending on how far the weapon is away. But bottom line is, the greater the energy, in this particular case, what we're trying to do is replicate a gunshot. We can see that we have that little fine mist. And again, we know that that fine mist is not going very far.
Judge, may we approach?
And I apologize for that, but, you know, old courthouses sometimes need repairs. So, all right. Mr. Ringel?
Thank you, Judge.
In this particular slide here, what I'm illustrating, it's called a drip pattern. Remember, we looked at the single droplet as it hits the surface, and again, surface texture has pretty much controls the appearance of the resulting stain. In this case, we've started with some blood on the surface here, this cardstock or this graph paper, and what I'm demonstrating or showing you here is, as each additional droplet, in this case we just see one droplet, hits that existing pool, well, what ends up happening is you have the creation of what's called satellite spatter. And I'm sure you've maybe seen this even at home. Say your sink is dripping, drip, drip, drip. What happens is, with each subsequent drip, you have more satellite spatter radiating out. And what's important about this is, as it radiates out, what I'm talking about in all directions, so 360 degrees, you have these small little spatter stains, very small, And that tells me that something above this pool or something above this pattern was there long enough to drip sufficiently to create these satellite spatter, which you'll see. So the droplet hits. And you can see all of the satellite spatter that are created. And with each additional droplets, what you'll have is a buildup of this satellite spatter around, they call that the parent stain, because everything radiates out or comes from the parent stain. So one of the things that we look for is that parent pool or that parent stain. When we see those radiating spatter, then we have that drip pattern that we're talking about.
Sir, do you have a laser pointer with you?
Yes, I do.
Would you be able to use that laser pointer to point out that parent pool and then the satellite stains that you were referencing?
So this would be the parent stain here. And again, once that droplet comes in and hits it, it creates all of these little satellite spatter. And again, if you notice, they're distributed pretty evenly if you drop it in the middle. If you were to drop it off to one side, again, not to get too into it, but certainly they're going to drip, you'll have satellite, but there may be a predominance on one side versus the other. But again, I see that radiating pattern around that parent stain. Again, this is an example. This is in one of the classes over at Boston University where the students create these various patterns. So here, this is on the concrete floor. And basically what they do is they drop blood. They drop 6 droplets here, and they drop them into the same stain if they can. And you can see the radiating spatter, satellite spatter around that stain. Notice how they all come out. If we look at them, for the most part, the tails will be pointing outwards. If we were to get in there and really look, the tails are pointing outwards. There are some exceptions because they don't really get a chance to settle down. Remember I talked about this going on when it's released? Well, ultimately, they may point slightly different. This is the vertical surface. So think about this. This is the floor. Here I'm dripping onto the floor. Now, envision this as a wall. So here I have a wall which is close by here. Notice what happens as this droplet, now when that droplet hits that parent pool, those little satellites come off, and again, they come up and they come down. They call it a parabolic arc, but just like throwing a ball. So what happens is, if that vertical wall is close enough, I'm going to get those little, I'm going to get those little stains before they hit the surface or the concrete or the floor. If that wall's close enough, as they go up, they're going to hit the wall. And depending where that wall is, those satellite spatters may not have reached their maximum height, so it may be very close, or they may be at their maximum height, or they may be down here as the stains are starting to fall down. But, for example, if I were in a gymnasium, I wouldn't see this, but if I were in the corner of the gymnasium, I might see that. And again, it gives me an indication of where that event occurred. All right, so that's what we're looking for.
And when you say where that event occurred, what do you mean by event?
And I use a bloodletting event. In other words, in this particular case here, that could be someone dripping, standing, as I'm dripping down, because I'm standing close to the corner here, as I'm standing, I'm dripping, creating the satellite spatter, and again, close enough to the wall that I get that on that vertical or that wall surface. The other thing that we need to take a look at as well, and this is a definition, all the definitions that are contained here, there's actually a terminology that we use, and if you notice at the bottom, I footnote it's a terms and definition and bloodstain pattern analysis. We all use the same terminology. But basically, we have a pool, which is a bloodstain resulting from an accumulation of liquid blood on a surface. Actually, it should state a non-porous surface for the most part, because it's non-porous when you have a pool. Because think about it, if I have a piece of cloth, ultimately that's going to saturate down, and that's called a saturation stain. But essentially a pool is what we have here, and this is, again, the pool's amassing. What we actually have in this particular slide here, at some particular point, once the blood in this case is deposited on the floor, you immediately get clotting that starts to occur. As blood sits there, again, remember I talked about the platelets and I didn't talk about fibrin, but the blood will actually begin to clot. And at some point, you actually get the clotting going on here, and you get what's called serum separation, because that liquid begins to pull out as the red blood cells and the platelets all pull themselves together. So that does give me some indication that that pool here was there for some amount of time. But again, time is very difficult because it depends on several factors, and I may say that again. Certainly the temperature has something to do with it. Certainly the humidity has something to do with it. The actual porousness of the floor may have something to do with it as well. So you have to be very careful about that. You'd have to replicate the conditions and know the conditions that you were in order to try to replicate that. Flow patterns, they don't seem very important, but they are actually extremely important. So essentially what we have is, this is a vertical surface, right? Because again, remember, gravity is pulling everything down. So what we have here is, this is an actual deposition of wet blood onto a vertical surface. And again, there's a sufficient amount of blood where it begins to run down, in this case, the wall. What's important with flow patterns, what we look at is, many times flow patterns can tell us if a victim were standing. Because if I incur some type of significant injury, gunshot or whatever, traumatic injury to my face, not uncommon to see blood flow going down my entire front of my body. Likewise, on the tops of my shoes or the tops of my feet. Let's just say I didn't have my shoes or socks on. Likewise, the other thing that we look at is we look at the bottoms of an individual's feet as well, because it's not uncommon for a victim to, say, struggle with their assailant where they're literally stepping in their own blood. So those are all things that we look at because it gives us an indication at some point the victim was never up or the victim was up, and if they were up, let's just say they have some flow pattern down to their knees, and then I have what appears to be a transfer, well, they were at least on their knees. So again, flow patterns are actually important when we take a look at cases. And again, another example, in this case here, how it relates, this is what we have here is a flow pattern. The victim is lying on their back on the floor, but this photograph here tells us, or tells me, that the victim was never up at the time that the wound was incurred, if you think about it. Wound is here on the chest. Ultimately, the blood is flowing down, because again, blood wants to flow down. Likewise, head up is up here, so this is the lower portion. So essentially, the victim was on the ground when they incurred that wound. Victim was never standing, but instead was on the ground. Transfer stains. Basically, what we have is a surface wet with blood. And if I were to take a surface such as my hand, wet with blood, well, what we've done up here is, this happens to be an implement, again, from one of the classes, but we go from left to right, and we go down to that second row. And what you find is, which makes sense, the top left is going to have the most blood on it, so obviously it's the heaviest concentration of blood. And as I move across, there's less and less blood that you find on the surface. And many times, and let's just say, and you'll hear me use these terms, a footprint or a footwear impression. A footprint is if I literally take my shoes and socks off. That's the friction ridge skin on the bottom of my foot. Just like we have palm prints, we have footprints. So that's if I have my shoes and socks off. You can literally identify a footprint because it has the same type of ridges that are contained on your palm. A footwear impression is if I have something covering my feet, whether it be some type of athletic shoe or whatever, where I transfer that information, okay, to a different surface. So just to clarify which is which, but again, what we usually find if we're looking at, say, footwear impressions, somewhere in between is the best. The heaviest one covers over some of the detail, and as we move along, usually you find them around the middle of the deposition is your best impression.
Is that the entirety of the demonstrative?
Yes, sir.
All right. Judge, we can take this down for now. So running through the demonstrative, you've talked about some of the basics of the science that you're applying in the work that you do. Can you talk to the jury a little bit about what methodology you utilize when you approach a scene for the purposes of analysis.
Sure. So again, well, when I approach a case, there are occasions where I go out to scenes, but when we look at a case, the first thing you want to take a look at are all the photographs, because again, you don't want any of that extraneous information. In other words, you don't want to read any witness statements. I don't look at any of those. You look at all the photographs, and again, if I have photographs, if I have videos, to get an idea of what type of patterns we have, because the first thing we have to do is identify the patterns, and then from there I'm able to get the mechanism, and then knowing what type of mechanism I have, then I know potentially what type of implements may have been used, what may have gone on. Something is from, say, a firearm to maybe even just my arm. Now think about it. I could have blood flowing down my arm as I do one of these things. That's called cast off. In other words, if I were to, and you do this probably in the morning when you take a shower, if you reach for that towel, that water comes off your hand, and basically it's going to be deposited in this, what we call a curvilinear. So again, it gives me an idea of what's going on when we identify that. So I'll look at all the photos. From there, I get an idea of what type of patterns I have. If we go back a while ago, I talked about projected patterns, and I'm doing this only because everyone realizes you have a carotid artery here. Well, it's possible during some type of aggression or whatever, that could be transected or whatever, it could be cut. And basically what you have is the literally pulsing of the heart as it's pushing the blood out. So here I have this curvilinear line. But before I go, or before I make a statement to say investigators that I have this arterial spurt, certainly I need to know from the medical examiner's records, and having worked in the medical examiner's office, that I have to have some type of artery, whether it's carotid, brachial, femoral, or even the radial artery. I have to know that that's been damaged.
So when you approach your work, whether it's looking at a case generally or looking specifically at a scene, sounds like you're looking initially at photographs. Mm-hmm. You're looking at videos as well. Is that correct? The
videos, at first officer on the scene videos. Many agencies now use the body cams, as they're referred to. So I'll get copies of those, and I have software where I can literally go frame by frame. So essentially in 1 second of video, I can pull off 30 photographs. And then from there, again, autopsy, then I go to the lab reports to find what evidence was recovered. And based upon the evidence that was recovered, then look at the results of the examination. In other words, many times agencies will swab blood stains. And of course, it's important to know, first of all, that it's blood, right? Because it's not uncommon to have some other substance that may appear to be blood. Likewise, it's not uncommon. I've had instances where there's blood at the scene, but from a prior incident, not only from a prior incident, but from a prior individual. So again, if it's available, you need to look at that as well. And then from there, then I'll go through, sort my photos, I've identified my patterns, and ultimately come up with my hypothesis as to what happened, how the mechanisms, or what mechanisms were involved. And then once I get to the point where I've put all that together, I have my report there. But then for the reconstruction part, we have to consider any and all, whether it be officers' statements, what they believe they saw, because I've had cases, I've had witnesses alongside a victim who were incorrect in what they thought they saw. So we obviously have to assess those as well when we consider what is the most likely possibility of what occurred or transpired.
You mentioned the body cams or the videos, and you also mentioned those videos of the first responding officers. Why is that important to the work that you do?
Because first responding officers, if you think about it, nothing has been touched there. Basically, the scene is pristine as you're going to get it. And I will say that many times, whether it be sometimes first responders, when I say first responders, EMS will get there prior to, and of course they're going to assess the victim. Sometimes they've captured that on body tape, body cams, but then they can take some notes as to who did what. But again, that's as close as we're going to get to say a pristine scene.
You mentioned one of the things that you're looking for initially is trying to make a determination of the mechanism is what you referenced. What did you mean by mechanism?
Well, again, if I have, let's just say I have photographs, and I have the autopsy photographs as well. I told you those are important. Well, if I have some type of incised wound or a cutting wound, okay, incised being longer than it is deep, but it's telling me that there's some type of sharp implement there. And again, if I have something where I have my spurt pattern, okay, I have some type of, say, a spurt where it may indicate some type of artery has been breached. Certainly now I go back to the autopsy report and look at the doctor's report to see if, in fact, what wounds I have. Likewise, if I have a cartridge case at the scene, fired bullet, I'm going to go back to the lab reports to see if they did an examination, what caliber it was, what was involved. Then I'm going to go over to the medical examiner. Do I have a penetrating wound? In other words, a penetrating wound is when the bullet goes in but it doesn't exit. A perforating wound is when the bullet goes in and it exits. So again, that tells me there could be a bullet at the scene that they may not have recovered, or certainly considerations that have to be taken into account when you're evaluating the entirety of the scene.
Clearly, it's important to you to have an understanding of what caused the injuries. You talked also about the caliber of the bullet that was fired. Why would the caliber matter to you in the work that you do?
Again, not to get too technical, but certainly the mass of the bullet, size of the bullet has an effect, but it's actually the velocity of the bullet that has more of an effect. So again, if I have a high-speed 45 caliber bullet, that's certainly going to potentially do a lot more damage than, let's just say, I have a 22 shot round. Because again, what bullets are actually have a rating to them, feet per second, so that gives me an indication of what type of kinetic energy is involved. Because again, when something, such as a bullet, hits something, there has to be a transference of some of that energy, and that's what causes, for example, remember I talked about before, that high speed. So if I have a round that's hitting me at 1,000 feet per second, when that round hits, some of that energy has to be dispersed, and the reason why they are so small is because the higher the energy, the only way a liquid can disperse it is by creating smaller stains, because that energy is actually dispersed across the number of stains created. So again, that's going to tell me what type of damage I have.
A perforating wound versus a penetrating wound, why is that important to your analysis specifically?
Well, of course. Well, again, remember, a penetrating wound, there's a potential of back spatter. I know that I'm not going to have, and we looked at it in the video, any forward spatter, right, because the bullet never exited. So I could have some back spatter as a result of the actual bullet once it makes contact with the skin. That perforating wound, if I have a round that's coming in, and it comes in and it's actually going out, well, a lot of that energy is going to be expended or continue on with the bullet. So that's when I get that, could be even tissue that moves forward and continues to march. So again, why that's important to me, I've had that happen where when I go back, and let's just say I have a perforating wound, and I've had agencies miss the actual bullet itself. And what will happen is when I look at the photos, it's a perforating wound. Now I go back and look at the photos. I tell them that you missed a bullet because it went through and you didn't find the bullet. So again, you need to know that it tells you the dynamics of what potential you have.
If you're dealing with gunshot wounds, does the number of wounds matter to you, and if so, why?
Oh, yes, sure. And the reason being for, let's say, the number of gunshot wounds, I have an initial wound, and let's just say it's a penetrating, perforating wound, it doesn't really matter going through. What that does for the second and subsequent shots, and I've had this happen where it creates a pool, and let's just say and I'm using this only because it's easy to see, I'm in my face here, as the round comes through, I'm going to do some damage, and let's just say I do some damage to my jaw, and I'm going to have some bleeding going on, I have some saliva, but what that does is it creates a pool, because I'm bleeding, right, actively bleeding. When that second bullet comes in, it's going to create that pool that causes that, say, additional back spatter, because again, that energy's got to be released. And I've actually had the case where the second round created a tremendous amount of back spatter, because essentially, as the medical examiner referred to it, it was almost shooting into a mud pool. So it created this tremendous amount of back spatter.
We've gone through quite a bit of information. One of the things you are talking about and have talked about a little bit is back spatter. Talking specifically about gunshot wounds and a second gunshot wound, there potentially being more back spatter than with the first wound. Can you talk again, and I think the example that was used was the blood on the sponge with a .22 caliber bullet penetrating it. Can you just once again explain what back spatter is?
So here I have the sponge, this bloodied sponge. As the bullet strikes the sponge, well, what happens is part of the physics is equal and opposite reaction. Some of that energy, as that bullet hits, causes that spatter to be directed back. And if you recall, I've actually mentioned I've had at least 2 cases where the gun was close enough where the spatter actually was inside the barrel of the gun, because it gets projected back, again, trying to dissipate that energy as it hits that initial side of that sponge prior to going through.
I understand that your answer is going to be it depends, but...
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sir. It does depend.
Well, but my question for you is, how far can that blood spatter travel? So that back spatter, excuse me.
In the literature, they've talked about 4 feet, at least in some of the literature. There have been cases presented that are even further than 4 feet. I've had a case where it was as much as 8 feet, where there was some back spatter that was detected. Actually, with some tissue that was detected as well, not just back spatter.
And when you say tissue, I think it's fairly clear, but you mean biological material from the...
Such as skin or fat. Underneath the skin, you have a layer of what's called adipose, so fatty tissue that can actually be dislodged in either back spatter or forward spatter.
Before we talk about the work that you did specifically on this case, any other concepts that you think are important for the jury to understand that inform the work that you did here?
I did neglect to mention, I talked about transfer stains, where I have something, wet with blood touching the surface. I may use 2 terms, and one of them being swipe and the other being wipe. Now, just to be clear, if I had some blood on my countertop at home, well, if I had the liquid on my countertop at home and I took a clean rag and I wiped through it, that's considered a wipe. So essentially I have pre-existing blood that I wipe it away. A smear would be if I have a hand wet with blood or paint or whatever, and I come across a clean surface, that's a swipe. So a transfer is just something where I contact the surface, and I'm not sure, there's no motion associated with it. But if I have motion associated with it, many times I can tell that it was pre-existing, so I have a wipe, or it wasn't pre-existing where maybe my hand, I have an injury. I was putting it on the side of my face to try to stem the flow of blood, and then I just happen to touch this and as I'm moving across the surface. So that would be the swipe. Again, something bloody, it has to obviously wet with blood, comes across that surface where I deposit the blood on that surface.
We moved through this pretty quickly, but one of the concepts that you discussed, I think when we were looking at a blood pool, was the concept of clotting. Can you explain what clotting is and the factors that affect clotting?
Again, clotting, once once you lose blood or once your circulatory system is breached, the blood, it's a natural occurrence that wants to fix itself, so the clotting mechanism takes over. So when we lose blood outside, and let's just say we have some type of criminal offense, and I have blood which is deposited as you saw in that slide, well, that same mechanism takes over. Okay, the platelets start to pull themselves together, the red cells start to pull together. There's fibrin, it's a stringy material which pulls all of the cellular material, the white cells, the red cells, and whatever, and that's what leaves you with the serum, that yellow liquid that you see, that straw colored, that ultimately pulls together. And there have been some studies out there, and one of them that's used many times is the Lee White study. And basically what they do is, and now this is clinical in a hospital, 3 to 15 minutes. Now that's in a hospital where they took some blood, placed it at 37 degrees, which is 98.6, in a water bath, just to see it as it clots, because again, it was blood that was taken from an individual's arm. When we talk about a scene, that can vary dramatically, because we have to think about the absorbency of the surface that it's on. We have to think about the temperature. We have to think about the humidity that's out there. We also have to think of even a pool. Now let's just take this is a porous surface, this is a carpet, so it would saturate down, but let's think about, say you had a linoleum floor at home. That floor may appear to be flat, but you may have little dips in there. So here I have this area where the blood could pool up. Just that little area where it dips, that could affect the clotting of the blood as well. So we really have to take all of that into consideration. So again, for the most part, you can't say with any degree of accuracy that's 5 minutes and 37 seconds. No, it doesn't happen. What you look for is overall, again, holistically, what we look at, remember I talked about clotting, but not only do we have clotting, but we have drying. So ultimately, we need to look at all of that. In the entirety of the scene, how does the scene look? You know, is it just a little bit of clotting here? Is there overall drying of the scene and clotting of the scene? So again, that's why we need to look at the entirety of the scene.
I think you referenced that clinical study. You said in that clinical study the minimum amount of time was 3 minutes, and you said up to 15 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes.
You just mentioned drying. Is there a difference between blood drying and the concept of clotting?
Oh, yes. Yeah, well, blood drying, essentially blood could dry before clots, fully clots. Again, drying is when all the moisture evaporates from it. So as I mentioned before, clotting is really the drying process. It's just that the blood is present long enough where all of the cellular material begins to pull together and you have that leaching out of the serum onto whatever surface you're on. In fact, it goes so far as clotting can actually occur on clothing as well. And it could be for a number of reasons. It could be because of the presence of blood, just clarify that, or it could be the perpetrator came back sometime after the crime and did some type of action that caused clotting on the victim. And let's just say I moved the victim or whatever and I picked up clots as they were forming, and say I wiped it on my shirt or whatever. So there is a possibility of sources for clotting to appear on clothing, whether it be the suspect's clothing or the victim's clothing.
Can you talk now about the work that you did in this case? What is the first thing that you did on this case?
Again, all of the photos, I would have looked at the entirety of the photos, and then I would have gone to the videos, the body cam videos.
So essentially you followed that protocol or methodology that you outlined previously.
Yes, sir.
Should be fairly obvious, but what are you looking for when you get this initial information? You're looking at the photos and videos.
Again, looking to identify blood patterns that exist in the scene. So as I mentioned before, first we identify the patterns, then from there we're able to identify one of, say, 6 mechanisms, and then from those mechanisms we know that, and I keep using that arterial spurt, and sometimes you hear people talk about it. You see this inverted U on a wall or whatever. Well, if I have that, then I want to go back to the autopsy report to see or determine as to whether or not I have some type of artery that's breached. If not, it could be some type of severe injury that's running down my arm as I happen to be moving around the scene. So identify the patterns, which give you the mechanism, which then you look for what could have caused that, or what actions may have the victim or the suspect taken. Certainly, let's just say it's not uncommon to try to clean up a scene. So when you look, you may find white patterns, you may find, so when you look at the scene, here we have a victim who's supine, or excuse me, laying on the ground. They appear to be deceased, but yet here I have some white patterns that are either on the wall or they're on the floor, so I know there's been what we refer to as post-event activity.
You said you had photos, you had body cam images in this case. What other information did you have access to?
I actually had, 1 minute, Your Honor. I actually received, I believe, most, if not all, of the information that was available, which there is some of it I did not review, but I have a list. Do you need me to go through that?
No, you don't need to go through that list. I think we can talk about it as it becomes relevant to the work that you did. You stated you relied on photographs in reaching some of the conclusions in your report. Did you include those photographs in the report that you prepared itself?
So what I do is the photographs that I rely upon in writing my report, I actually make those a copy of my report. So essentially, as I write my report, my photos progress from 1 through whatever the number of photos I have. Likewise, I usually divide them up into areas of what I call areas of interest. So in other words, it might be a particular room here, it may be the actual victim here, it could be the suspect. So again, as we go through the report, the photos go in line with my report.
I'm going to approach and show you what have been marked as State's Exhibits 217 through 259.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Your Honor, at this time, the State would move to admit State's Exhibit 217 through 259 by stipulation of the parties.
Ms. Watt, any objection?
No, Your Honor.
All right, State's Exhibits 217 through 259 are admitted.
The State would request permission to publish.
You may.
Would it assist you in discussing the work that you did to look at the photographs that you included in your report?
Yes, sir.
Any additional information that you believe is important before we look at these photographs?
No, sir.
A second.
All right, I'm showing what you have marked in your report as photograph number 1, that's State's Exhibit 217. What are we seeing here?
So this would be the left side of Mr. Cooper's face, and we're looking at the 2 entrance wounds. Of note there, not only do we have the 2 entrance wounds, but we also have, if you notice, it's clear in the left edge of the left eye. You can see the stippling, those little red areas. They almost look like little red dots on the skin. Basically, that's the burn, because again, as a bullet comes out of a firearm, not only does the bullet come out, but the primer residue, because when a bullet fires, in this case, you have the primer residue as well as the propellant. And as the bullet comes out, some of that propellant's coming out, some of it's burnt and unburnt, and some of that primer, if you do have a primer in there, but basically it gives you that indication of how close the firearm is. So what we see here is Mr. Cooper, his face has been washed down, the 2 entrance wounds as well as the stippling.
Could you use your laser pointer to point out the stippling that you were referencing?
So we have the entrance wound here, and we have the entrance on the lateral side and the medial side of the face here. And I'm sorry, you can see the stippling here going on, and we can pick it up. We can see it here as we look around here. So we have what, again, stippling. That's, whether it be in this particular case where it's red, that's some of the powder as it sears the skin when it contacts the skin.
As a forensic investigator, what does that tell you, if anything, about where the gun was in relation to Mr. Cooper's face when it was fired?
Well, normally what would happen is you get a range from the medical examiner how big that cone is, because when a firearm discharges, what will happen is that propellant or that primer residue will follow the bullet, and it comes out in a conical nature or a cone. And ultimately it begins to, remember I mentioned before, gravity and air resistance, it slows it down and ultimately it falls to the ground. Well, normally what will happen is your medical examiner may, and not in all cases, either from the clothing or from the wound, get a pattern of how big that pattern is. And if you recover the firearm, you have to use the same ammunition, you have to use the same firearm caliber and make. Ideally, they use the same gun if they recover it. And what they do is test firings, usually of white cotton, at various distances to determine the barrel to distance of the firearm. But the fact that the firearm wasn't here, the best you can do is that the firearm, or at least the end of the barrel, was fairly close. And there are some textbooks that quote distances. The Mayo, for example, would give you a distance when you have this type, or at least stippling, but again, the barrel is within a distance where you get that stippling or gunshot residue.
You noted the entrance wounds. Were you aware of any exit wounds?
There were no exit wounds, sir.
Why is that important to you?
Again, if you're looking for any type of forward spatter, not only that, but if I have an entrance wound here and I have an exit wound, let's just look at that example. Well, I would anticipate I'm going to have bleeding from both this side flow as well as this side. If I only have an entrance without that exit, so here I have the exit, then essentially when I'm looking at the photos, I'm saying, okay, the only source of blood is right here. And granted, there will be some out of the nose and mouth because I have the fracture, skull fracture, so I have the associated nose and mouth, but I'm certainly not going to get anything here. So again, trying to associate what I have in the photos with the wounds that have been documented by the medical examiner.
Showing you what's been marked in your report as photograph number 2. It states exhibit 218. What are we seeing here?
This is the, I believe, east side of the house, and I believe in the reports this was referred to as the front door here. If you notice, there's 2 steps leading down, and there's actually a railing that not only runs along the outer perimeter here, but it also goes across, and there's the actual gate.
This is a demonstrative that's previously been admitted as states exhibit number 305, which essentially is an overview of the crime scene. Would it assist your testimony to reference that as well?
Yes, sir.
Judge, with the court's permission, I would ask to once again publish states exhibit 305.
You may.
Yes, sir.
And we've heard some testimony previously that the door that we're seeing here is the door behind the recliner that Mr. Cooper was found in on the date of offense. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, sir.
Any further information from States Exhibit 218?
No, sir.
States Exhibit number 219, what are we seeing here?
In this photograph here, I'm trying to give an overall view of the scene. And again, we're looking at the door here. As I mentioned before, here's that railing, comes off the house, comes down and around, and you can see there's an actual gate right here opening. And what we have here is a piece of metal that goes across along the step itself, or just above the step. And we can see the gates open, and likewise we have this, I believe was a Michael Kors purse or a Michael Kors clutch, I'm not sure the correct term, but that happened to be a purse that was on the concrete.
And are you able to display for the jury using your pointer where that area is on States Exhibit 305?
This is the Michael Kors?
I'm sorry, just the stairway that you were referencing.
Again, the stairway here, and we can see when you go up one, they call it a stair tread. So as you go up the first stair to that stair tread, you can see the metal extending across the base of the railing. And we can see how this here, the actual gate, swings from here on that left side. And then we climb the next step, second step, third step to what I refer to as the landing.
And so we can orient ourselves with the crime scene.
Oh, sure.
On the States Exhibit, the demonstrative there.
So here's the door right here. So here we have the recliner, and this is the door here. And this is where you'd step out and make your way, making your way down the stairs, out this way. Here we go through the door, down the stairs, and making your way that way.
Thank you. This is States Exhibit 220, marked in your report as photograph number 4.
Mm-hmm. And so what we have here, these are referred to as placards, evidence placards. So we can see that we have number 6, 7, and 8. And what they indicate is some blood stains. This is the doorway, that front door as I refer to it, east side of the house. We have some blood stains here, some blood stains here. Likewise on the concrete stair tread, as well as that cross member. I'll use the term cross member. Here's the railing. Here are the hinges, so the gate is swinging back from, as I come down the stairs, it's going from left to right, opening.
May we approach quick?
You may. Still all able to see the screen up there? Okay. Okay, I'm getting head nods, so.
And Mr. Martin, are you still able to see States Exhibit 305?
You know, I may have to stand at some point if you don't mind, and I can stand in the box, but,
If you need to stand up to see it, that's fine.
okay, thank you.
All right, this is marked in your report as number 5, States Exhibit 221.
So I actually have there, it's two photos in the series. One is the photo as I received it, and then the following photo, I used Photoshop to actually indicate areas of blood stains, in this particular case, on that stair tread, the first one, if I may, coming out the door right here. That's that landing. This would be the siding, the east side of the house, as one would go into the house.
States Exhibit 222, marked as number 6 in your report, you indicated you'd used Photoshop on the previous photo to indicate some blood stains. Is that what we're seeing here?
Yes, sir.
What type of stains are these?
They appear to be drip stains. Again, remember, as I talked about before, we can see the irregular shape of the stains. This happens to be concrete. Certainly there's some small stains here. We can see small stains. We do have an indication of how big, but again, they appear to be some type of a drip stain on the surface.
Marked in your report as number 7, States Exhibit 223.
Yes, sir.
What are we seeing here?
Again, this is the first in the set of two. The second one, I've marked it up, but we can see the placard, evidence placard number 7, and we have an indication here of size, and we can see the various stains here, which again are circled in green in the next photograph.
I'm showing you now what's been marked in your report as number 8, States Exhibit 224. What types of stains are these?
And again, remember I talked about the irregular surface here. Actually, they're very close together. They almost appear to be, size-wise, very small, but they appear to be drip. Well, they could almost be even a transfer, but more likely drip, because they all appear to be, irregular circular stains. But again, certainly close together. This one, irregular shaped stain. So I don't know if that's some type of contact or again, the impact at a slight angle. But again, due to the surface texture, it's tough to delineate exactly what they are.
Again, just so we're clear where this image was taken, is it your understanding that this is on that stairway that you had referenced?
Yep, yes, sir. So we had the landing, which is number 6. This is on that first step, as one were to step down from the landing. If I were leaving the house, that would be that first step down. And again, this would be the following step, as one would be come out the door. We're at the landing for 6. Now we're moving down the first tread, and now we're down to that second area. That's that cross member, the term I'll use, cross member of that railing, where we can see some stains. And again, that surface texture, right, the concrete, we can see some irregular shaped stains. Not only that, but here we have again, I use the term footwear impression. So what we have here is what appears to be the outsole or the bottom of a shoe that's contaminated with blood. As it contacts this surface here, it leaves the impression. We don't have the shoe. One of two things. We could have a positive impression. Okay, and a positive impression would be, think about this. So here I have a shoe. Now just envision I have this shoe, and a positive impression would be if I have the treads that are sticking down, that's contaminated. So when the tread comes down, I'm actually leaving a positive impression, if that makes sense. So in other words, if I have blood on the tread and I press it down, That's a positive impression. What you can find is what we refer to in Bloodstain is negative impression. Good example, let's just jump to my finger. If I were to take some blood and put it on my finger, and I were to carefully wipe it across here, the blood on the top of my ridges, because we've all looked at our fingers and we see these elevated ridges, well, I could wipe that off, and if I did leave an impression, that would be a positive impression. Likewise, what I've seen at crime scenes where someone will touch something, they leave a positive impression because they touch it sufficiently to leave blood on the surface of their ridges on, in this case here, the speaker. Well, as I move along, the blood is off the top of my ridges, but if I press down hard enough, what ends up happening is the blood, we call those the furrows. All right? So in other words, if you look at your tires, those recessed areas, those are called furrows, or on your shoe, those recessed areas. If I press down, that could literally give me what's called a negative impression. But what we do have is, whether it's a negative or positive impression, we do have what appears to be a footwear impression here on that railing, or that cross member, excuse me.
And for the record, that was State's Exhibit 225, marked in Mr. Martin's report as number 9. Showing you State's Exhibit 226, marked in your report as number 10. What are we seeing here?
Again, I've gone through, and this appears to be spatter. I've used arrows to indicate what looks like spatter. And again, spatter being something, some type of force has been applied to blood. And it could be any number of things, create these little spatter stains. Notice how they're circular in nature, and granted it's hitting the surface. Again, these appear to be some type of drip stains, but I have some very small, and again, blood wants to hold on to something. And just a quick example, if I were to wash my hands, for the most part, the water's going to come off. If I do this type of thing, that's going to create those small little stains. So when I start to get these small little stains like that, and again, what we're assuming here is all the red-brown stains in this particular case here are blood. That this type of small stain here, there was something that created that. And it could be something as simple as the shoe. Envision the shoe slapping down. It could have created, or some of that blood to come off and create that spatter. So again, size, as I mentioned before, is important, as well as the shape of the stain.
And just to be clear, you said the shoe itself could have caused that spatter where it contaminated.
Oh, it could have been on the top of the shoe. I call that the upper, just in case I use the term. The upper would be anything other than the outsole. Just another photograph here from a different view, where they've placed the placard, the evidence placard number 8.
And that's State's Exhibit 227, noted in your report as number 11. And again, what are we seeing here in State's Exhibit 228, your number 12?
Yes, we did in the previous photograph. It's just a different angle. As I mentioned before, I just thought it was important to put the 2 different angles, because I'm not sure that in the previous photo we were able to capture that, or was able to illustrate that for the jury.
Judge, I think this may be a good time for our morning break.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it has been going about an hour and a half, so we will take our mid-morning break now, and ask to be ready to go in approximately 15 minutes. And again, I'd remind you of the admonition I gave you many times already, so see you in a bit.